Hello, this is the set of videos dealing with democracy. We'll be talking about democracy, authoritarianism, and then we'll be moving on to talk about types of democracies over the rest of the half of the class, and also types of authoritarianism. So democracy is really kind of a difficult thing to teach. It's a difficult thing to teach because what do we mean by democracy? We all use the term democracy a lot. We talk about democracy. This is a democracy. America's a democracy. All these things, but really, what do we mean by it? I think democracy is kind of a difficult term. It's a difficult term because I think generally when we talk about democracy, particularly in the American context, we talk about democracy as kind of an outcome. You know, democracies are our friends. Democracies lead to more happiness, better economics, better decisions, and those are really outcomes of a political system. And you see, I think democracy is actually something different from that. I think democracy is a process. It's far better to understand as a process. And I think we kind of confuse different types of democracies with democracy. So if we think O'Neill kind of talks about democracy as a political power is exercised either directly or indirectly through participation, competition and liberty. And so he's kind of talking about decisions being made from participation from the people in some way. And I think that's an okay definition. I'm going to give us a slightly different definition. A definition comes from Robert Dahl, D-A-H-L, D-A-H-L. Robert Dahl, who's a political theorist at Yale, or was a political theorist at Yale, and it's really one of the leading kind of theorists of modern democracy and power. I'm going to give the definition that he uses. It's not actually a definition of democracy, it's a definition of something else. And then I'm going to talk about what I think we think of as democracies, which I really think we should be thinking of the term liberal democracy, which I think we often bandy about. And when we think of liberal democracy, we think of America, we think of Germany, we think of Britain, and that's the democracy I think we tend to use, and I'll come to that. I mean, that's really democracy. That's democratic societies which emphasise individual rights and freedom. And I would say that liberal democracies are like this Dahl's definition of polyarchy. I'm going to give you Dahl's definition of polyarchy. Polyarchy plus a commitment to individual rights and freedom. So I think, I'm going to define polyarchy, which is Dahl's definition. And that's how I think we should judge countries, as polyarchic or not. And then when they're polyarchies, we should say, are they polyarchies which have this commitment to individual freedom and individual liberty? And if they are, and also generally that involves a commitment to capitalism as well, then we can say they're liberal democracies. So how does Dahl define polyarchies? Well, Dahl defines polyarchies in a number of ways. Firstly, a polyarchy has control over government decisions about policy being constitutionally vested in elected officials. So what does that mean? Well, I think the important thing there is constitutionally vested. If you think about it, who makes, say, the decision to go to war in America? Well, it's the Constitution tells us it's Congress. Who makes decisions to pardon criminals of their crimes? Well, that's a power which is held constitutionally, is vested in the power of the presidency. So if you think about it, our powers are the important policy making powers and policy implementation powers in America are vested by the Constitution in elected officials. That's not true in all societies. If we think about it, we talk about Iran a lot. And, Iran this, Iran that, and is Iran going to have a nuclear weapon and things like that? Well, decisions about nuclear power in Iran aren't constitutionally vested in elected officials, rather they're invested in the Supreme Council, the religious body. So we might say that in fact power in Iran is not constitutionally vested in elected officials, or in North Korea, power is not constitutionally vested in elected officials but in Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, so maybe someone else. So I think, firstly you must have power as vested in elected officials, not monarchs. There are a number of societies which have historically had monarchs, or people who call themselves presidents who are not really presidents and not elected. Secondly, elected officials are chosen in frequently and fairly conducted elections where coercion is relatively uncommon. So we can elect officials, and the old stories of dictatorships, election results in dictatorships being announced before the vote happened, or 100% voting for one official. We might think that just because you say you're elected doesn't actually mean you're elected. So what we must think about, elected officials must be elected in frequent and fairly conducted elections. And so we might say American elections are examples of this, where coercion is relatively uncommon. Now that doesn't mean that there's no coercion, but coercion is relatively uncommon. Look, if I tell one of my kids I'll kick them out of the house unless they vote the way that I want them to, that's coercion. But that isn't relatively common in America, and so we would say that would not be that would allow us to talk about free and fair elections. We might look at Egypt. Egypt has elections, but they aren't really fair, and they aren't happening without relative uncommon coercion. Countries where you have a military dictatorship organising elections tends to not be, those elected officials tend to not meet the standard that's needed for polyarchy. Thirdly, practically all adults have the right to vote in elections of officials. So if we think about it, who gets the right to vote? Now, not all adults. So, and that isn't necessarily a problem. So, for example, today, I can't vote in American elections. I pay tax. I live in America. I'm a permanent resident, so I have a green card. I'm allowed to work. I'm allowed to, do all the things that Americans are allowed to do. The one thing I'm really not allowed to do is take part in elections. I'm not allowed to vote. We tend to think that's not a big problem because practically all adults are. Now, we might say, where do we draw the line? So for much of American history, women couldn't vote. We would then have to say that America is not a polyarchy until women get the vote, because women are more than half of adults, and so they're, by definition, practically all adults. If women can't vote, are not included. We might also say in American history the problems that African Americans have had in voting, largely when African Americans were slaves and so defined as property, and so not given the vote. But even after the Civil War, African Americans in many southern states could not vote until the 1960s. And I think we'd have to question whether, in places like Mississippi, where you're talking about, I think 15 to 20% of the population cannot vote, not because they're legally barred from voting, but because if they register for votes, their houses will be burned down and they'll be murdered. We might say that America in the South at that point was not a polyarchy. Practically all adults have the right to run for office. Now, of course, if we think about this class, my guess is that none of us can run for all elected office, and we won't be able to run because we won't be able to run for the presidency. I can't run for the presidency because I'm, one, not a citizen, and two, not a natural born American. But if you think about it, most of you are not actually old enough to run for many offices. But that's okay, right? Because that's a problem that will disappear. So if we think about it, practically all adults must be able to run for office, and that's generally true in America. It's not true in places like Iraq historically, where many candidates have been banned from running, or in Egypt again, where members of the Muslim Brotherhood cannot run for election. We would say that, look, that's limiting. That's too limiting to who can run. 5, citizens have the right to express themselves without fear of severe punishment on political matters. Well, this is really kind of some concept of free speech, but free speech is not absolutely free. I mean, America has a very, very historically liberal view to speech, far more liberal than places like the United Kingdom, where speech is more limited. Or, for example, Germany. In Germany, if anyone's seen the film Inglourious Basterds, the Quentin Tarantino movie, on the poster in America there's a swastika in it's like, the symbol, the German Nazi symbol that these Americans go and then, I won't ruin the film. But in Germany, that poster was banned, and they had to kind of cut out the swastika, because showing a swastika or Nazi speech in Germany is illegal. We generally still would say that Germany is a polyarchy because the punishment is not severe, i.e. it's not death or anything, it's a fine. But speech can be limited, and for a polyarchy, speech just must be, most people must be able to speak freely about political matters without the fear of severe retribution. 6. Citizens have the right to seek out alternative sources of information. If you think about it, if the media is controlled completely by the government and there is no chance that you can find other information, then your reality is structured by the government. You can't know if the government is doing a good or bad job. This does not mean that the government can't set up its own state broadcasting system. Americans, again, don't like the idea of a state broadcasting system. But many countries, for example, like the United Kingdom, have a state broadcasting company, the BBC, State Broadcasting Corporation. So does Australia, so does Canada, so do many countries, which we would say are polyarchies. The BBC, while not a mouthpiece of the government, even if it was a mouthpiece of the government, would not really limit polyarchy, country being a polyarchy or Britain being a polyarchy, as long as British citizens could go out and find other sources of information. They don't need to do it, but they must be able to do it. And this is where we might say countries like China are not polyarchies. China's not a polyarchy in many ways, but because people can't go out and find new sources of information, different sources, non-state sources of information. 7. Citizens have the right to form relatively independent organisations, including political parties. Without political parties, it's almost impossible to imagine how a polyarchy or a democracy could function. Political parties help us organise politics. They help articulate people's views. And if we banned them, or if we didn't allow them to happen, that would almost be impossible for us to have a real political life or to challenge the leadership of the state in any way, shape or form. So political parties are vital, but it's not just political parties, it's things like trade associations, other interest groups like labour unions. These groups allow citizens to access power in some way and to limit the actions of the government and to actually organise together. So belonging to even a sorority acts as a fraternity acts as an interest group which pushes the interests of individuals. We need those. If you think about it, and we'll talk about Nazi Germany, but one of the things that the Nazis did in Germany was limit these types of interest groups, and that's we'll talk about that particularly when we talk about totalitarianism. All right, so that's Dahl's kind of basic definition of polyarchy. Polyarchy is really a more limited view of what we normally think about democracy. I didn't talk about anything like people being free. I didn't talk about anything about economic policy, capitalism. I didn't talk about outcomes. I didn't talk about anything like that. And I think it's better for us to think of democracy, and not think of democracy in the way that we do, but think of democracy as polyarchy, this kind of process by which decisions are made in polities, which allow citizens to access that in some way. I think now, if you ask me, I'd prefer to live in a liberal democracy, which is the polyarchy plus these concepts of individual liberty. But really, I think that's what we should be thinking of, like this kind of polyarchy as a way to think about how countries are either polyarchies or they're not. Once we talk about polyarchies, we can see a variation, but they're either polyarchies or they're not. I'm going to finish this video now, and then there's going to be a second video that talks about the development of kind of liberal democracy.